India Through a Traveler's Eyes. Pearl S. Buck. Pearl S. Buck, 1892–1973, American by birth, was reared in China by her missionary parents. She taught in a Chinese university. She is known for her travelogue and memoirs. She wrote personal accounts of her visits to different countries in simple, lucid and effortless English. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1938. Notable among her chief works are The God's Earth, 1931, a novel on China, and Come, My Beloved, with India as background. The present piece India Through a Traveler's Eye sees an extract from My Several Worlds, which is a personal record of her life. It shows her love for the poorest people living in Indian villages. India had always been part of the background of my life, but I had never seen it whole and for myself until now. Yet the stories that our Indian family doctor and his wife told me when I was child had woven themselves into my growing dreams, and I had long read everything that I could find about that country. From my father one had learned of it through Buddhism and the life history of the Lord Buddha. The very word color reminds me of the variety of hue that is Indian life, as various as our own American human scene. In Kashmir, where the white barbarian invaders from Europe long ago penetrated India, the people are often fair. Auburn-haired, blue-eyed women are beauties there. A young Indian friend of mine has recently married a Kashmiri man who, though his hair is dark, has eyes of a clear green. The skin color of the Kashmiri is a lovely cream and the features are as classic as the Greek. But all the people of India must be reckoned as belonging to the Caucasian race, whatever the color of the skin in the south, though it be as black as any African's. And India has an amazing way of appearing unexpectedly in other life, as for example, today in the life of South Africa, the Indians make a third group between the South Africans, and the black and white. For that matter there was our Indian family doctor, and why should there have been an Indian doctor in a Chinese port to tend an American family? And rumors of India persist, for they are a memorable people, dramatic and passionate and finding dramatic lives. You see how India has a way of permeating human life. And consider how India has managed, merely by maintaining her independence, and yes, by producing superior individuals, to influence the world in these few short years of freedom. They have put to good use the benefits the English gave and left, the knowledge of the West, the pure and exquisitely enunciated English tongue of men and women educated on both sides of the globe. Witness Nehru and with him a host of men learning how to govern, and the first woman to be the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations a woman of India, and the man in charge of the prisoner exchange in Korea an Indian general, who won trust from all. Even the blustering and accusation at home and abroad have not changed the quiet confidence of the new India, and this confidence, founded in unyielding idealism, permeates our world life. What did I go to India to see? Not the Taj Mahal, although I did see it and by moonlight, not Fatehpur Sikri, although I did see it, and not the glories of empire in New Delhi, although I did see them. I went to India to see and listen to two groups of people, the young intellectuals in the cities and the peasants in the villages. These I met in little rooms in the city, in little houses in the villages, and I heard their plans for freedom. Already the intellectuals believed that another world war was inevitable. They had been bitterly disappointed after the First World War by what they felt were the broken promises of England. The English, they declared, had no real purpose to restore India to the people. I could believe it, fresh as I was from China, where the period of people's tutelage seemed endless and self-government further off every year. When you are ready for independence, conquerors have always said to their subjects, etc. But who is to decide when that moment comes, and how can people learn to govern themselves except by doing it? So the intellectuals in India were restless and embittered, and I sat through hours watching their flashing dark eyes and hearing the endless flow of language, the purest English, into which they poured their feelings. The plan then was that when the Second World War broke, India would rebel immediately against England and compel her, by this complication, to set her free. They would not be forced, as they declared they had been in the First World War, to fight at England's command. And then? I asked. And then, young India said proudly, we will ourselves decide whether we wish to fight at England's side, or against her. What they did not reckon on, when the time came, was the savagery of Nazism and the aggressions of Japan in Asia. When they perceived that they must choose between the Axis and the English, they chose the English, aware that in spite of many injustices they were choosing between barbarism and civilization. They postponed their plans for freedom, Gandhi meanwhile doing his work within his own country until the war was over, and by then the wisest minds in England, understanding the New World, returned India to her people, in spite of all opposition from English men and others who did not have sufficient understanding of Asia to know what wisdom was. Not even Churchill's prophecy of bloodbath, partly fulfilled at that, could prevent the inevitable. India had waited as long as she could, and peasants and intellectuals were on the same side in the old invincible combination. It was Gandhi's strength that made him know very early that both peasant and intellectual must be one to work together for their country. His hold was equally strong upon both, and so he achieved his end, without war. Perhaps, we Americans do not yet fully understand the great lesson that India has to teach in thus winning her freedom. Beside her mighty triumph of a bloodless revolution, our war of independence shrinks in size and concept. India has taught humanity a lesson, and it is to our peril if we do not learn it. The lesson, that war and killing achieve nothing but loss, and that a noble end is assured only if the means to attain it are of a piece with it and also noble. The real indictment against colonialism, however, was to be found in the villages of India. There was rot at the top, too, in the thousands of young intellectuals trained in English schools for jobs that did not exist except in the limited civil service. The towns and cities were frothing with unhappy young men, cultured and well educated, who could find no jobs and were not allowed by the old superstructure of empire to create them. But the real proof of evil, I say again, was in the miserable villages. I thought I had seen poverty enough in China, yet when I saw the Indian villages I knew that the Chinese peasant was rich in comparison. Only the Russian peasant I had seen years before could compare with the Indian villager, although that Russian was a very different creature, and inferior in many ways. For the Indian peasant was like the Chinese in being a person innately civilized. The maturing culture of an organized human family life and profound philosophical religions had shaped his mind and soul, even though he could not read and write. And the children, the little children of the Indian villages, how they tore at my heart, thin, big-bellied. And all with huge sad dark eyes. I wondered that any Englishman could look at them and not accuse himself. 300 years of English occupation and rule, and could there be children like this? Yes, and millions of them. And the final indictment surely was that the lifespan in India was only 27 years. 27 years. No wonder, then, that life was hastened, that a man married very young so that there could be children, as many as possible, before he died. I loved England, remembering all the happy journeys there, but in India I saw an England I did not know. And I was forced to see that if the English, in many ways the finest people on earth, people who blazed the way for all of us to achieve the right of men to rule themselves, if colonialism could so corrupt even these, then indeed none of us could dare become the rulers of empire. It seemed to me, as I lived with Indian friends, new and old, that all the ills of India could easily have been mended if there had been a government whose purpose was first of all to benefit the people rather than to live upon them. The desert dry country, for example, the fruitless land between Bombay and Madras, was already famished although it was only February, and the sun hot enough to fertilize any seed, had there been water. And why was there no water? Why not sink artesian wells, or even dig shallow wells, since I was told, the water table was high. But the enervated and exhausted people had not the strength to take such initiative after the years of colonialism. It was more than that. The worst result, perhaps, of the colonial system was to provide the subject people with an infinite excuse against work and so against helping themselves. You are responsible for me, is always the sullen attitude of the subject to the ruler. You have undertaken to feed me and clothe me and govern me. If one die, it is your fault. There were always the British to blame, and certainly the blame was not always just. Yet essentially perhaps it was, for when the heart of a people is gone, their spirit dies with it. Looking back, I find that among the many impressions of the people of India, absorbed while I lived among them, and still clear in my mind, is their reverence for great men and women. Leadership in India can only be continued by those whom the followers consider to be good, that is, capable of renunciation, therefore, not self-seeking. This one quality for them contains all others. A person able to renounce personal benefit for the sake of an idealistic and is by that very fact also honest, also high-minded, therefore also trustworthy. I felt that the people, even those who know themselves venal and full of faults, searched for such persons. The devotion given nationally to Gandhi and finally even internationally is well known, but I found the same homage paid to local persons who in their measure were also leaders because of their selflessness. Thus I remember a certain Indian village where I had been invited to visit in the home of a family of some modern education, though not much, and some means, though not wealth. The house was mud-walled and the roof was made of thatch. Inside were several rooms, however, the floors smooth and polished with the usual mixture of cow dung and water. The active master of the house was not the head of the family, but a younger brother. This I discovered when I arrived, for before we entered the house, my host led me to a curious sort of cage standing well above the ground on 4 posts. Inside the cage, made of wire netting, I saw to my amazement an aging man lying on his back, his head supported by a pillow. My eldest brother, my host explained. He has had a stroke of paralysis, and though we beg him to live in the house, he chooses to. live out here so that he may be ready to listen to the villagers when they come to him. My host spoke fair English, but the elder brother spoke none, and we could only exchange greetings and look at each other with friendliness. What I saw was intelligent, thin, pain-sharpened face, whose eyes were at once wise and piercing. The body was quite helpless, but it was scrupulously clean and the cotton garments were snow white. We exchanged a few remarks, and then a group of villagers approached, not to see me but to talk with the elder brother, and so my host led me into the house to meet his young wife and children. All during my stay I watched that cage, and seldom indeed did I see it except surrounded by people, and never, as long as daylight lasted, without at least one man squatting on the ground, talking earnestly and then listening. My host said, "My brother has always been our wise man. Now he is our saint." My host, I observed, had his own place, too, in the village life, for twice while we were eating our luncheon that day he rose from his corner of the room and went out, to answer a shout, apparently from a neighbor. When he came back he made the same explanation. I was called to kill a dangerous snake. The luncheon was plain country fare, lentils, rice, spinach boiled very much, condiments. Before we ate, an old cousin brought in a brass ewer of water and a clean homespun towel for us to cleanse our hands with, a necessary preliminary to eating with the fingers. Chopsticks I had used all my life and preferred them to knife and fork, but after I had got used to eating with my right hand, I liked it as well. After all, what is so clean as one's own right hand washed? And from babyhood the Indian children are taught that the right hand is for clean services such as eating, and the left hand may perform the more lowly tasks. Another cleanliness was that our food was served on fresh green banana leaves instead of plates. Well-cooked rice piled on a broad green leaf is a pleasant sight and stimulates the appetite. In any household where caste was observed, the food was placed on such leaves or on dishes of fresh pottery, broken after we had finished with them. My host fulfilled the requirements of his caste by eating in the opposite corner of the room, and sitting on the floor with his back to us. By now I had learned to overcome my first feeling about a distance such as this. It was simply a private devotion to a religious feeling and not inhospitality. Religion is ever present in Indian life, in its best as well as in its worst aspects, for there, as elsewhere, fanaticism reaches into evil. I liked the simple acceptance of religious motive, however, and the perfect freedom to behave as one's religion moved the soul. Thus in my first Indian family, an intellectual and fairly well-to-do one, while I sat and talked with my hostess in her living room, an Indian gentleman came in without speaking to us and moved gracefully to the far end of the room, his bare feet silent upon the floor. There he knelt, his head bowed, and so remained for perhaps a quarter of an hour. When I glanced at him curiously, my hostess said in a manner entirely casual, "It is my husband's eldest brother. He comes here during the day at his prayer times, since his own home is at some distance from his place of business." When the prayer was over, the brother went away again, and it was not until later that I met him, and then it was outside of prayer hours. My life has been too crowded with travels and many people for me to put it all within the covers of one book, however, and indeed all my books have not been enough to tell the things I would like to tell. Years after I left India I wrote Come, My Beloved against its background. Strange, the Americans, except for a few, have not understood the real meaning of that book, but the Indian readers understand. We have not lived long enough, perhaps, to know universally that the price of achievement, whatever the goal, is an absolute. In my book I chose 3 Christian missionaries to prove it, for of all the people that I have ever known, the missionary is, in his way, the most dedicated, the most single-hearted. He believes that God is the one, the Father of mankind, and that all men are brothers. At least the Christian says he so believes, and so he preaches. Then why has he failed to change the world in spite of his sacrifices? Alas, they have not been enough, and he has not been willing to pay the full price for faith. Ha pays only part, unable to accept utterly the full meaning of his creed. I see the same refusal here in my own country, over and over again, and not only among Christians. But the people of India know what it is to be willing to pay the last full measure of the cost of an idealism. They understand, and to them my book is not a puzzlement.